Colour fidelity is always an issue. Getting consistent colour in your workflow and being confident that the colour that you're outputting is printable and doesn't change unexpectedly when viewed under different conditions. That's what colour management is about. And it's not just about calibrating your screen. You have to manage the colour of your files as well. So here are some of the most important nuts and bolts in that process, and we start with the colour settings.
We think that you will dig this.
Going from the menu to Edit Colour Settings. Now the North America General Purpose 2 default settings in Photoshop, they're fine for a web designer using sRGB as a flavour of RGB, which is used by internet browsers and also used by most consumer snapshot cameras. The CMYK settings are set for general average printing conditions in the US, which differs a bit from the printing conditions in Europe, with different papers and different ink standards. We need to make a setting for pre-press, and I'm going to make a setting suitable for a retoucher or photographer based in Europe. So you can adapt this for your region. Start with giving yourself more options. Then you choose, in the main drop-down menu here, you can choose, if you're in America, North America Pre-Press 2, and that's pretty much it for you. Or go to Europe Pre-Press 2 here to load a preset which fills in all the drop-downs here below the main drop-down. Immediately here we get the Adobe RGB, which is much better suited to retouching and generally accepted by everyone in the industry as a good RGB retouching workspace, with a fairly good gamut of colours, a large range of colours, and it's a workspace that converts very well into most flavours of CMYK. When it comes to CMYK, we here have the coated foie gras 27, which might not mean anything to you, but I can tell you that it's a web press, i.e. a roller press setting, and we could maybe make a slightly higher quality setting here to use for general CMYK workspace, and that's the sheet fed foie gras 39. So I just went on the drop down there and chose this particular one. As you can see, you've got the Japan settings, US various settings there. And further down you can see also lots of profiles that you probably haven't got, but just ignore what I've got here. Now even though we've chosen this profile, that doesn't mean that we're going to convert our files into the foie gras 39 ISO coated space. Mostly we're just going to use it as a general soft-proof CMYK to check as we work that the colours are printable for offset press in general. We're going to use it as a kind of benchmark. Before we save this setting, I need to show you just one other thing. Notice that on the colour management policies, all these checkboxes are now ticked, so that you will now be warned when, for example, you get a file from a client that was created in another kind of colour space, for example in sRGB. This will give you a chance to either convert it or work with the file as it is, but at least you'll know what you're doing, you'll be aware of what kind of file you're working with. So let's save this setting. Clicking on Save, and the first thing we do is to just give it a name. Let's call it Europe Pre-Press foie gras 39. I know that's a bit long, but let's do it. Then press Save, and I'm just going to add foie gras 39 there at the bottom. Okay. You now have a variation of the Europe Pre-Press 2, but with just a slightly more optimistic CMYK preset there. All we need to do now is click OK, and it will take effect next time you restart Photoshop. Just to show you the concept of colour gamut, I've plotted the sRGB and the Adobe RGB colour spaces into a ColorThink graph. ColorThink is an amazing program for visualizing a gamut and also for doing various parts of colour management. In this, the solid part is sRGB, and the wireframe shows the boundaries of the Adobe RGB, And as you can see here, that's bigger than sRGB, especially in the blue-green range. So choosing Adobe RGB as an RGB color working space gives a larger color allowance, but that's if you use it right from the start, from the processing stage or the scanning stage. The relationship between color working space and profile is very simple, really. The working space is generally the setup that we just did here in the color settings, where I chose Adobe RGB because it's the most commonly used profile for the files that I retouch. So you can describe a file as having a color profile of Adobe RGB or as being tagged with an Adobe RGB profile. The profile acts almost like a passport or an identity card. It's a file within a file, if you like. It tells Photoshop what the meaning of its colors are. If you get down to the nitty-gritty, a Photoshop image is a mosaic of different colored square pixels, and each of these has a number formula for red, green and blue. An RGB combination of a pixel in sRGB doesn't always have the same output meaning as the same formula in Adobe RGB. Especially in the blue-greens, it can give a very different CMYK color output. And that's why you need to know a little bit about all this, because your screen is only a previewing device for these different formulas of color. It's essential that you're using a calibrated monitor and that you calibrate it regularly. The larger the gamut of your monitor and the better the quality, obviously, the better that's going to work for you. It's also worth knowing that a calibration is only as good as your hardware and the software that you use, and that the calibration doesn't necessarily make your monitor perfect. It's not an exact science, but that's no reason to bypass it altogether. Let's now look at how we can soft-proof to simulate a CMYK output on screen. I chose this green and pink image because these are colours that are difficult to keep within printable CMYK gamut. When you put a bit of saturation or a bit of contrast on them, very often they pop out a little bit too much for paper and ink to reproduce them properly. I'm starting here with the image before any colour corrections are done, and the first thing we're going to do is check whether it's already got some unprintable colours. So the first thing we do is to go to View, Gamut Warning. Now the gamut warning describes where the trouble colours are. It doesn't describe how it changes them. You can see there in the shadow in the background and around the window that we've got some kind of trouble there. Well, let's turn off the gamut warning again. View gamut warning, toggle that off. And we're going to now simulate how the colours change in CMYK. We go to View and Proof Setup first to just check that we've got working CMYK there. Now that's the CMYK that we previously just set in the colour settings, and that's ISO coated FOGRA 39. Having checked that, we can now go to Proof Colors, which has Command Y also as a shortcut, and you can see here it says CMYK in the top bar here. I'm now in the standard viewing mode. Now we can toggle very easily between RGB and CMYK by simply just pressing Command Y. So back to RGB again, and looking at the image, it actually looked lighter in CMYK, something that's pretty rare. Very often colours tend to go darker and flatter in CMYK. Back to CMYK again, and the colours a little bit lighter and darker in RGB. So that's brilliant. We have in fact here a quite benign CMYK conversion. Now let me turn on the colour adjustments that I've done on the image. And as you can see here, they are giving the image quite a lot of contrast, but not a lot of saturation. I've worked very hard to not add too much saturation in as I've been colour adjusting it. Generally, saturation is the problem. That's what's going to drive the colours out of gamut. So the image has got a bit richer, a bit darker, and toggling between the CMYK and the RGB, you can see there that still her shadow there is a little bit lighter, so that's excellent. What I often do is troubleshoot the layers. If I find that some saturation has been added and it's too much, I then tend to find the offending layer by turning off all the layers and then back one by one to find out which layer has caused the colours to go out of gamut. Now I've made a hue saturation layer with 20 plus in saturation. Looking at it straight away, it just looks juicier on the whole image looks juicier and punchier. But let's have a look closer in. Zooming in there, we have a really hard edge. She's got a shadow that's broken up into bands here. And this is what happens when colours go out of gamut. They snap into the closest possible colour. This is really cause for rejection of a file here. And the great thing here is that obviously that we've done this as an adjustment layer. So all we need to do is really just turn it off or just delete the whole thing. Now I'm going to do a very geeky thing, and I'm going to show you this image plotted into ColorThink. So here you have a very abstract version of the image, the colours of the image. Let's just take that for a little bit of a spin around. So you can see the pinks and the greens going into yellow. Turning on the wireframe of the RGB, you can see that it fits very nicely and neatly into this, and it actually goes out right to the edges of the gamut, and that's what's causing us a tiny bit of a problem there. You won't ever find an image that completely utilizes the gamut here all over. Whatever colors you have in the image will be represented usually in sort of one area, 2 or 3 areas there. So taking that for a little spin again, looking at that from all directions in Adobe RGB. Now let me turn on the coated fogra 39. Now that's in a solid block of color there. And you can see some of those dots of the image colors outside it. And that obviously means that these are the clipped colors. Now I just said the word clipped, and that is interesting because it does relate to gamut. When you clip your exposure, you very often throw colors out of gamut. So that's one thing to look out for. Yes, so these colors are now out of gamut, and you see them outside the CMYK gamut or CMYK range here. Generally the colors that go out of gamut are the very strong colors or the pastel colors. Now I know this is a very geeky way of looking at color, but it's also very useful to get to know which colors tend to misbehave and which ones you can work with quite safely. The final issue I want to cover is converting and assigning. If you go to Edit, Convert to Profile and convert the profile to sRGB, the first thing you'll find is that the image is flattened, so you will lose your layers. That shouldn't stop you from doing it when you need to do it. For example, if you're sending to somebody who's viewing it in their email viewer or browser, then I think it always makes sense to convert to sRGB, because you never know if the application they're going to be viewing it in is actually savvy enough to understand Adobe RGB. And sRGB is that all-round consumer color space that every application seems to understand. Obviously, you don't want to convert your original document and save that. You want to do that on a duplicate. The reason why you see my info here is that another thing has happened as well. I've got a couple of color samplers, one in the green and one in the pink here. And you can see here that the colors have actually changed numbers. The blue in number 1, for example, was 6 and it's now 0. And the red color has changed quite a lot from 217 to 243. So here comes one of those all-important rules that when you convert to profile, the actual numbers change, but Photoshop strives to keep the image looking exactly as it is. Now the opposite happens when you assign a profile. Going in the same place to Edit and Assign Profile, you get a warning box, and I'll tell you why. When you click on the profile, you see in the preview that the image actually changes its appearance, but the numbers actually stay the same. And also you're keeping the layers. So the numbers we had before we assigned the profile stay the same, but the appearance of the image changes. Where this also comes into play is in mismatch handling. When you get a dialog like this, it says that the document has an embedded profile that doesn't match the RGB working space. Well, the embedded profile of this document happens to be sRGB, and the working space, as you know, is Adobe RGB. So it gives you three options. Use the embedded profile, convert it to the working space, or discard the embedded profile, i.e. don't color manage. Well, as you can imagine, the latter is not a very good option. Convert the document. Well, you may be tempted to do that because if you're working in Adobe RGB as your working space, that would be a nice and neat thing to do. But generally, I'd say you wouldn't get more colors from actually converting it. You wouldn't get any better colors either. And very often, to retain the quality, I would actually use the embedded profile. So if your file comes in sRGB and you haven't got the option to get an original file in Adobe RGB, that's absolutely fine. You can work with it even though you've set your working RGB to Adobe RGB. So in that case, I would just click OK here. Now here's the final little color management conundrum. If you get a file that doesn't actually have an embedded profile, what do you do then? Do you leave it as it is? Do you assign the working RGB, or do you assign any choice of profile here on the drop down? Well, I'll give you a tip here. I think the best thing always in that case, because this is a file really without a color identity, is to assign the sRGB profile. It's called assuming a profile. If a file doesn't have a profile, you have to assume it's something, and sRGB tends to give the file usually the kind of look that it was captured at, more or less. It's probably the safest profile in this case. And then you can choose whether to convert it to the working RGB straight away or not. Just do remember that if you do the latter, then the file will actually go through two conversions and then probably later also converting again to CMYK. And converting colors more times than necessary is not really a thing we want to do. This has been a very brief look at managing the color of your files, but if you do follow these simple tips, you should get it right for most images without any particular color problems.
But it is not really a bossa nova. But we think that you will dig this.